The doors of the great hall burst open before Alira could even remove her wedding veil, and the cold night air rushed in like a warning. Lord Alaric Voss stood at the top of the stone steps, a folded letter shaking in his hand, his face carved from anger. Just hours ago he had placed a ring on her finger. Now he looked at her as if she were a stranger who had slipped into his home under a false name. "Explain this," he said, his voice low and hard, "before I lose what little patience I have left tonight." Alira stepped forward, still in her wedding dress, the fabric catching on the cold stone floor. She had no idea what letter he held, only that his eyes had changed since the moment the messenger arrived at the feast. One instant he had been raising a cup to toast their future. The next, he was reading a page that turned his face to stone. "I don't know what that is," she said. "Alaric, please tell me what it says." He unfolded the letter slowly, deliberately, as though giving her one last chance to confess before he read it aloud. "It says that you were sent here to gather information for my enemies. It says your family arranged this marriage not for peace, but to open the gates of Draymore from the inside." He looked up. "It has your family seal." The color drained from Alira's face, not from guilt, but from the shock of hearing something so absurd spoken with such certainty. "That seal could belong to anyone with a skilled hand and bad intentions," she said. "I have never worked against you. I did not even want this marriage at first, you know that. I agreed because my father believed it would stop a war." "A convenient story," Alaric said, though something in his voice wavered for half a second before hardening again. "You expect me to believe that a letter bearing your family's crest, delivered on our wedding night, is nothing more than a coincidence. I expect you to trust the woman you just married over a piece of paper handed to you by a stranger," Alira said, her voice rising now, more from disbelief than defiance. "Who brought you this letter? Did you even ask his name?" Alaric's jaw tightened. He had not asked. The messenger had appeared at the edge of the hall, delivered the letter into the hands of a guard, and vanished into the night before anyone thought to question him. In the heat of the moment, the missing detail had not mattered. Now, hearing Alira say it aloud, a small crack of doubt opened somewhere behind his anger. He pushed it away. He could not afford doubt, not with his family's history of betrayal, not with the ghosts of his past standing so close behind him. "It does not matter who brought it," he said. "What matters is what it says, and I will not have a viper sleeping under my roof, wearing my name, waiting for the right moment to strike." The hall had gone silent. Servants who had been clearing the wedding feast stood frozen near the walls, afraid to move, afraid to be noticed. Alira felt every eye on her, felt the heat rising in her cheeks, felt her heart pounding so loudly she was certain everyone could hear it. She had grown up in a quiet house, far from politics and plots, and nothing in her life had prepared her for standing accused in front of a hall full of strangers on the night that was supposed to begin her new life. "I am not a viper," she said, steadying her voice as best she could. "I am a woman who agreed to marry a man she barely knew because it seemed like the right thing to do for people she loved. If you truly believe I would betray you, then you never really looked at me at all tonight. You only looked at that letter." For a moment, Alaric said nothing. The great hall, lit by dozens of candles that had been meant to celebrate a joyful night, now felt like a courtroom. He thought of his father, murdered by a woman his family had trusted completely, a woman who had smiled at their table for years before opening the gates to men who ended his father's life. He thought of the years spent rebuilding trust in Draymore, brick by brick, promise by promise. He could not let that happen again. He would not. "You will leave the castle," he said finally, each word deliberate, final. "Tonight, before sunrise. I do not want to see your face inside these walls again until I know the truth of this letter, one way or another." Alira's breath caught in her throat. "Leave. Alaric, it is the middle of the night. Where do you expect me to go?" "That is no longer my concern," he said, though the words tasted bitter even as he spoke them. Some part of him, buried deep beneath the anger, wanted to take the words back the instant they left his mouth. But pride and fear, and years of guarding himself against exactly this kind of moment, held him firmly in place. "A guard will escort you to the village. You may take what you can carry." "You are making a mistake," Elira said, her voice trembling now, though she refused to let the tears in her eyes fall in front of him. "One day you will learn the truth, and you will wish you had listened to me tonight instead of a stranger's letter." Alaric did not answer. He turned away from her, unable to meet her eyes any longer, and gestured to the guard standing near the doors. The guard, a young man named Rowan who had served the family since childhood, hesitated for only a moment before stepping forward to escort Elira from the hall. He did not look comfortable with the task, but orders were orders, and no one in Draymore questioned Lord Voss when his voice took on that particular tone. Elira gathered what little dignity she had left and walked toward the door without looking back. She would not give Alaric the satisfaction of seeing her break in front of him, not after everything he had just accused her of. But the moment the cold night air hit her face outside the hall, the tears came anyway, hot and fast, and she let them fall in the darkness where no one from the castle could see. She was led to a small room near the servants' quarters to gather her things. There was little to gather, since most of her belongings had not even been unpacked from her arrival that morning. She found the small wooden chest her mother had left her, the one item she had insisted on bringing herself rather than trusting it to the wagons. Inside, wrapped carefully in cloth, was a silver locket, the only piece of jewelry that had belonged to her mother, who died when Elira was just a child. She fastened it around her neck, tucking it beneath her collar, and closed the chest. Rowan waited outside the door, his torch casting long shadows against the stone walls. When Elira emerged, carrying only a small bag and the chest, he offered to carry it for her, but she shook her head. She did not want kindness from anyone connected to this castle tonight. She wanted only to leave with what remained of her pride intact. The walk to the village gate felt endless. Behind her, the castle rose dark and silent against the night sky, its windows glowing faintly with candlelight, its walls as cold and unwelcoming as the man who ruled inside them. She thought of her father, waiting for word that the marriage had gone well, that the alliance had been secured, that peace between their families would hold. She thought of how disappointed he would be to learn that everything had fallen apart before the wedding night had even ended. At the gate, Rowan paused. "My lady," he said quietly, using the title out of habit more than certainty, "I do not believe what that letter said. I have watched you since you arrived. You do not carry yourself like someone plotting against this house." Elira looked at him, surprised by the small kindness after everything else that had happened that night. "Thank you," she said, "though I fear your lord does not share your judgment." "He is not usually like this," Rowan said, glancing back toward the castle as though worried the walls themselves might report his words. "Something in his past makes him quick to fear betrayal. It does not excuse what happened tonight, but perhaps it explains it." "Explanations do not change what he has done," Elira said, pulling her cloak tighter against the cold. "But I appreciate you telling me." "Take care, Rowan." She stepped through the gate and into the darkness beyond, the village lights flickering faintly in the distance like small promises of shelter. Behind her, the castle gates closed with a heavy, final sound, sealing away the life she had expected to begin that night. Ahead of her lay a road she had never walked, toward a future she could not yet imagine, carrying nothing but a small bag, a wooden chest, and a silver locket whose true importance she did not yet understand. As she walked, she allowed herself one look back. The castle stood tall and unmoved against the stars, indifferent to the woman it had just cast out into the night. Somewhere inside those walls, Alaric Voss stood at a window, watching her small figure grow smaller on the dark road, the letter still clutched in his hand, and for the first time since reading it, he felt something that was not quite anger. It felt unmistakably like doubt. He told himself he had done the right thing, that a man in his position could not afford to take chances with threats against his family. But as her figure disappeared into the darkness beyond the village lights, a quiet voice in the back of his mind whispered that he had just made a mistake he would spend a very long time trying to undo. The road to the village was darker than Elira had imagined, lit only by a thin sliver of moon that slipped in and out behind passing clouds. Every sound made her flinch. Every rustle of leaves in the wind became, in her tired mind, the sound of footsteps following her. She had never walked alone at night before, not once in her entire life, and the fear of the unknown road pressed almost as heavily on her as the sting of what had just happened inside the castle walls. By the time the first rooftops of the village came into view, her feet ached and her arms trembled from carrying the small wooden chest. She had no plan beyond simply reaching shelter before the cold fully set in. She passed shuttered shops and dark windows, searching for any sign of light, any sign that someone might still be awake to help a stranger arriving in the middle of the night. At the edge of the village square, a single window glowed warm and yellow. It belonged to a modest inn with a wooden sign swinging gently above the door, the painted letters worn from years of wind and rain. Elira approached slowly, uncertain whether to knock at such a late hour, but the cold made the decision for her. She rapped softly on the door. After a long moment, it opened just enough for a woman to peer out. She was older, with silver hair pulled back into a loose braid and sharp eyes that studied Elira from head to toe in an instant. The woman's gaze lingered on the fine fabric of Elira's dress, now dirtied from the road, and on the exhaustion written plainly across her face. "You're not from around here," the woman said, though it was not really a question. "No," Elira admitted. "I am sorry to disturb you so late. I only need somewhere to rest until morning. I can pay, though not much." The woman studied her a moment longer, then stepped back and opened the door wider. "Come in before you catch your death standing there. I'm Marta. This is my inn, for what little that's worth these days." Elira stepped inside gratefully, the warmth of the small fire in the hearth wrapping around her like a blanket. The common room was simple but clean, with a few worn tables and chairs, and the smell of bread still lingering from earlier in the evening. Marta gestured toward a chair near the fire, and Elira sank into it without argument, setting the wooden chest carefully at her feet. "You look like you've walked straight out of trouble," Marta said, ladling a small bowl of soup from a pot near the hearth and setting it in front of Elira without being asked. "Eat first. Talk later if you want to talk at all." Elira accepted the soup gratefully, her hands still trembling slightly from the cold and the shock of the night. She ate in silence while Marta busied herself with small tasks around the room, giving her space without pressing for answers. It was the first true kindness Elira had received in hours, and it nearly undid the careful composure she had been holding onto since leaving the castle. When she finally spoke, her voice was quiet. "I was married tonight. And then I was sent away." Marta paused, a cloth still in her hand, but she did not seem overly surprised. "Sounds like a story with more to it than a few words can tell." "There was a letter," Elira said, staring into the fire rather than at Marta. "It accused me of things I never did. My husband believed it before he even asked me a single question. He ordered me out of the castle before the night was through." "Which castle?" Marta asked, though something in her tone suggested she already suspected the answer. "Draymore," Elira said. Marta's eyebrows lifted slightly, but she said nothing more about it, simply nodding as though filing the information away for later. "Lord Voss has always been a careful man, some might say too careful. Loss does that to people. He lost his father in a betrayal not so different from what you're describing, years back. Doesn't excuse what he did to you tonight, but it might explain the fear behind it." "Everyone keeps telling me that," Elira said, a note of bitterness slipping into her voice despite herself. As though understanding his fear should make it easier to accept what he did. "It shouldn't," Marta agreed simply. "Understanding why someone hurts you doesn't mean you have to forgive it right away. It just means you don't have to spend your whole life confused about it." She set down her cloth and studied Elira for a long moment. "You've got nowhere to go, I take it." Elira shook her head. "My father lives 2 days' journey from here, but I do not wish to bring this shame to his door so soon. I need time to think, to understand what happened before I face him with it." Marta considered this, then nodded slowly. "I could use an extra pair of hands around this inn. Work is honest, the pay is small, but you'd have a roof and a bed for as long as you need it. No questions beyond what you're willing to share." Relief washed over Elira so suddenly that she had to blink back tears again. "Thank you," she said. "I promise I will work hard. I do not know much about running an inn, but I am willing to learn anything you can teach me." "Good," Marta said, a small smile finally softening her sharp features. "We'll start in the morning. Tonight you sleep. There's a small room upstairs, nothing grand, but it's warm and it's yours for now." The room Marta led her to was indeed small, containing only a narrow bed, a wooden chair, and a chest for storage. But after the cold road and the humiliation of the castle hall, it felt like the safest place Alira had ever known. She set her own small chest beside the bed, removed the silver locket from beneath her collar, and held it in her palm for a long moment before finally allowing herself to sleep. The following weeks settled into a quiet, steady rhythm that Alira had never experienced before. She rose early to help Marta prepare the morning meals for travelers passing through, learned to mend torn linens, and grew accustomed to the particular creak of the third stair that always needed avoiding late at night. The work was hard on hands that had never known labor, and her fingers blistered more than once in those first days, but there was something satisfying about the simplicity of it, a kind of honesty in tasks that asked nothing of her except effort. She told herself in those early days that she would send word to her father soon, that she would explain everything and ask for his guidance. But each day she postponed it a little longer, unwilling to admit even to herself how deeply the humiliation of that wedding night still stung. It was easier for now to simply exist as Alira the innkeeper's helper, a woman with no title and no past worth mentioning, than to face the weight of everything that had happened. Word of Draymore still reached the village occasionally, carried by travelers passing through on the road between kingdoms. Alira found herself listening more closely than she wanted to admit whenever Lord Voss's name came up in conversation at the inn. She heard rumors that he had grown even more withdrawn since his wedding night, that he rarely left the castle walls, that something about the sudden end of his marriage weighed on him more heavily than anyone expected. She told herself she did not care, that his suffering meant nothing to her after what he had done, but some quiet part of her heart refused to fully believe it. One evening, as autumn began settling more firmly over the village, an old traveler stopped at the inn seeking shelter for the night. He introduced himself as Farron, a scholar who made his living studying old family histories and forgotten bloodlines for anyone willing to pay for the knowledge. He was a thin man with ink-stained fingers and eyes that seemed to notice everything, and he settled into a corner table with a look of quiet curiosity that Alira found both unsettling and oddly comforting. As she cleared his empty bowl that night, her collar shifted slightly, revealing the edge of the silver locket beneath it. Farron's eyes caught on it immediately, and something in his expression sharpened with interest. "That is an unusual piece," he said, gesturing toward the locket. "Might I ask where you came by it?" Alira touched the locket instinctively, tucking it back beneath her collar. "It belonged to my mother," she said. "She passed when I was young. I know very little about where it originally came from." "May I see it more closely?" Farron asked, his voice carrying a gentle urgency that seemed at odds with his otherwise calm manner. "I promise you I mean no harm. It simply resembles something I have spent many years searching for, and I would hate to let the possibility pass without at least asking." Alira hesitated, glancing toward Marta, who was busy across the room but who caught her eye and gave a small, encouraging nod. Slowly, Alira lifted the locket from beneath her collar and unfastened the clasp, holding it out for Farron to examine. He took it carefully, almost reverently, turning it over in his ink-stained fingers, and when he opened the small clasp to reveal the engraving inside, his breath caught audibly. "Where did you say your mother came from?" he asked, his voice quieter now, almost cautious. "I never knew," Alira admitted. "She rarely spoke of her family. My father always said it was too painful for her, that she had lost everyone she loved before she met him. I assumed she simply came from a modest family somewhere to the north." Farron looked up at her, and something in his expression made Alira's stomach tighten with a mixture of curiosity and unease. "This crest," he said slowly, "belongs to a family believed to have vanished entirely more than 20 years ago. If I am right about what I am seeing, then your mother did not come from a modest family at all." Alira felt her pulse quicken, though she could not yet understand why his words affected her so strongly. "What do you mean?" Farron closed the locket gently and placed it back into her palm, closing her fingers around it as though protecting something precious. "I mean, my dear, that I have spent nearly a decade searching for the answer to a question that many believed could never be answered. And I believe I may have just found it, sitting across the table from me, wearing it around her neck." Marta, who had drifted closer during the conversation without either of them noticing, set down the cloth in her hands and looked between the two of them with growing curiosity of her own. Outside, the wind picked up against the shuttered windows of the inn, as though the world itself sensed that something significant had just shifted into motion, something that would eventually reach far beyond the walls of the small village inn, and all the way back to the castle Elira had been forced to leave behind. Inside the castle, the weeks following the wedding night had settled into a silence that unsettled even the servants who had worked there for years. Alaric spent most of his days locked away in his study, poring over maps and correspondence, speaking only when necessary, and even then in clipped, distracted sentences. The wedding feast had been cleared away long ago, but the letter that started it all remained locked in a drawer of his desk, taken out and reread more times than he cared to admit. Corwin, his steward, had served the Voss family since Alaric was a boy learning to hold a sword too heavy for his arms. He had watched the young lord grow into a man burdened by responsibility long before his years, shaped by the loss of his father and the weight of holding Draymore together in the aftermath. Corwin had also watched, with growing concern, the swift and merciless way Alaric had cast out his new bride on the very night of their wedding. "You have not eaten a proper meal in 3 days," Corwin said one evening, setting a plate down on the desk despite Alaric's obvious disinterest. "Whatever guilt you are carrying will not be lightened by starving yourself over it." "I am not carrying guilt," Alaric said, though the words came out flatter than he intended, lacking the conviction to make them believable. "I did what was necessary to protect this house." "Did you?" Corwin asked, settling into the chair across from the desk without waiting for permission, a familiarity earned through decades of loyal service. "Or did you act out of fear before you had all the facts?" Alaric's jaw tightened, but he did not immediately dismiss the question, which told Corwin more than any answer could have. "The letter bore her family's seal," Alaric said finally. "What was I supposed to do? Ignore it?" "You were supposed to ask questions before passing judgment," Corwin said. "You were supposed to remember that a piece of paper can be forged far more easily than a person's character can be faked over the course of months of correspondence before your marriage." He paused, watching Alaric carefully. "Or have you forgotten how many letters passed between you and Lady Elira before the wedding? How certain you seemed then that you had found someone worth trusting?" The mention of those earlier letters struck something in Alaric that he had been trying very hard not to think about. In the months leading up to the wedding, arranged though it was, he and Elira had exchanged dozens of letters discussing everything from the state of the harvest to their shared love of old stories. He had found himself, more than once, looking forward to her replies with an eagerness that surprised him. None of that careful, thoughtful correspondence had matched the picture painted by the accusation in that single letter. "I have not forgotten," Alaric said quietly. "Then perhaps," Corwin said, "it is worth asking who benefits from convincing you to forget it so quickly." Alaric looked up at him sharply. "What are you suggesting?" "I am suggesting," Corwin said, leaning forward, "that I took the letter to a scribe in the lower town 3 days ago, a man who has examined documents and seals for this family for over 20 years. He tells me the seal on that letter, while a close match to Lady Elira's family crest, has small inconsistencies that a forger unfamiliar with the true seal might easily overlook. The wax itself was pressed with a stamp slightly smaller than the original, a difference of perhaps a hair's width, but a difference nonetheless." Alaric sat back slowly, the plate of food entirely forgotten now. "You had the letter examined without telling me." "I had the letter examined because someone in this castle needed to think clearly while you were too consumed by anger and old wounds to do so yourself," Corwin said, not unkindly, but firmly. I did not tell you sooner because I wanted to be certain before bringing you a theory built on hope rather than evidence. And now you are certain? Alaric asked, his voice carrying a tension that had not been there moments before. Certain enough to believe the letter deserves far more scrutiny than the single glance it received on your wedding night, Corwin said. Certain enough to wonder who would benefit from destroying an alliance between Draymore and Lady Alira's family before it had even properly begun. Alaric's mind immediately went to the neighboring territories, to the careful web of alliances and rivalries that had defined his family's political standing for generations. Few families would benefit more from a broken alliance with Alira's family than Lord Casimir, whose ambitions toward expanding his own influence had been a quiet, simmering concern for years. Casimir had attended the wedding feast himself, had offered his congratulations with a smile that Alaric now recalled had seemed just slightly too pleased for the occasion. Casimir, Alaric said slowly, the name tasting bitter as it left his mouth. I did not say his name, Corwin replied carefully. But if the thought occurred to you on its own, perhaps it deserves consideration rather than dismissal. Alaric rose from his desk and moved to the window, staring out over the darkened grounds of Draymore as though he might somehow see all the way to the village where Alira had disappeared weeks ago. Guilt, which he had been holding at bay through sheer stubbornness, finally broke through the wall he had built against it, flooding him with a weight that made it difficult to breathe. If what you say is true, he said quietly, then I sent an innocent woman out into the night on nothing more than a forged letter and my own fear. It would not be the first time fear has led a good man to a poor decision, Corwin said, his voice gentler now. The question is what you intend to do about it now that the possibility has been raised. I need proof, Alaric said, turning back to face him, something like resolve hardening in his expression for the first time in weeks. Not suspicion, not theory. If I am to make this right, I need to know beyond doubt what truly happened that night and who is responsible. Then let us find it, Corwin said, rising from his chair, quietly and carefully. If Casimir is behind this, he will not appreciate being investigated, and a man like that does not simply accept exposure without a fight. Over the following days, Corwin worked discreetly to trace the messenger who had delivered the letter, questioning guards who had been on duty that night, and searching for anyone in the village or surrounding towns who might remember a stranger passing through around the time of the wedding. It was slow, careful work, made more difficult by the fact that whoever had orchestrated the deception had clearly planned for exactly this kind of scrutiny, covering their tracks with practiced skill. Meanwhile, Alaric found himself unable to settle into the routines that had once occupied his days without difficulty. He rode out to the border villages more frequently than necessary, ostensibly to check on matters of trade and security, but in truth searching every road and every face for some sign of the woman he had sent away. He told no one, not even Corwin, how many times he had come close to riding all the way to the village where Alira had last been seen, only to turn back at the last moment, uncertain of what he would even say to her if he found her. It was during one of these rides, weeks into the investigation, that Corwin finally brought him news that changed everything. He arrived at the stables just as Alaric was dismounting from another fruitless ride, his expression carrying an urgency that immediately caught Alaric's attention. I found the scribe who wrote the letter, Corwin said, barely waiting for Alaric to hand off the reins of his horse. A man in the lower town, paid handsomely for his silence, though not handsomely enough to keep it once I made clear the alternative consequences of continued dishonesty. Who hired him? Alaric asked, though some part of him already suspected the answer. A servant in Lord Casimir's household, Corwin said. The scribe never met Casimir directly, of course. A man like that is far too careful for such carelessness, but the payment came from his household's coffers, delivered by a servant known to work closely with him. The scribe was given a description of your family's seal to copy as closely as possible, along with instructions on the content of the letter, all designed to sound convincing enough to provoke exactly the reaction it did. Alaric felt something cold settle in his chest, a mixture of vindication and fury that left little room for anything else. "Casimir orchestrated the entire thing," he said. "He knew exactly what kind of accusation would provoke me into acting without thinking." "It appears so," Corwin confirmed. "Whether his goal was simply to destroy the alliance between your families, or something larger involving Lady Alira's own family history, I cannot yet say with certainty. But the evidence against him grows stronger by the day." "Then we bring it before the council," Alaric said, already moving toward the castle with renewed purpose. "Casimir will answer for what he has done, and Alira's name will be cleared publicly, exactly as publicly as it was dragged through accusation on our wedding night." "There is one more thing," Corwin said, causing Alaric to pause halfway up the stone steps. "In tracing the scribe's records, I came across an older document, one that seems unrelated to the letter itself, yet mentions your family's long search for a missing bloodline. I believe Casimir may have discovered something about Lady Alira's family that goes beyond simple political rivalry. Something involving a search your own father began many years ago, before his death." Alaric turned slowly, his expression shifting from anger to something more complicated, a mixture of confusion and dawning realization. "My father searched for many things in his final years," he said. "Old debts, old alliances, old promises made to dying kings. What could Alira's family possibly have to do with any of that?" "I do not yet know," Corwin admitted. "But I believe it is worth finding out, and quickly, before Casimir realizes how close we have come to uncovering his scheme and decides to take more drastic measures to protect himself." As they climbed the remaining steps into the castle together, Alaric felt the weight of everything shifting beneath him. The simple anger that had driven him for weeks now tangled with guilt, urgency, and a growing sense that the woman he had cast out into the night carried a secret far larger than either of them had understood on the night of their wedding. Somewhere beyond the castle walls, in a small village inn, that secret was already beginning to reveal itself, though neither Alaric nor Alira yet knew how quickly their separate discoveries were about to bring them back together. Farron stayed at the inn far longer than he had originally planned, his curiosity about the locket overriding whatever schedule had first brought him traveling through the village. Each evening, after the common room emptied of travelers, he sat with Alira near the fire, carefully explaining what he knew and gently drawing out every fragment of memory she carried about her mother. "Tell me again what you remember of her," Farron said one evening, his notebook open on his lap, ink-stained fingers poised to record any new detail. "Even the smallest things matter, a phrase she used, a song she hummed, anything at all." Alira closed her eyes, trying to summon memories that had grown faint with time. "She used to say a phrase in a language I never understood, something she called an old blessing, whenever she tucked me into bed. I always assumed it was simply something her own mother had taught her, nothing more meaningful than a family habit." "Do you remember any of the words?" Farron asked, leaning forward. Alira concentrated, and slowly, haltingly, a few syllables came back to her, sounds she had not spoken aloud in over a decade. Farron's eyes widened as she spoke them, and he immediately began flipping through the pages of an old, worn book he carried in his travel bag, running his finger down columns of unfamiliar script until he found what he was searching for. "This confirms it," he said, turning the book toward her, though the writing meant nothing to Alira's untrained eyes. "This is an old blessing from the royal house of Heir, a kingdom to the east that fell into chaos over 20 years ago when its ruling family was nearly wiped out in a single terrible night. The few surviving members were believed to have scattered, hidden, or perished in the years that followed. Your mother's phrase is not simply a family habit, Alira. It is a fragment of a language reserved almost entirely for that royal house." Alira sat back, stunned, the fire crackling softly beside her as she tried to absorb what he was suggesting. "You are telling me my mother was part of a royal family that no longer exists." "I am telling you," Farron said carefully, "that your mother appears to have been a member of the Ashworth line, the ruling family of Heir before its fall. The locket you wear bears their crest. The blessing you remember matches their private language, one taught only within the royal household itself, not to common households even among the nobility. And if I am right about your age, you would have been born not long before the events that scattered the remaining members of that family into hiding. Marta, who had been listening quietly from across the room, finally spoke up. If this is true, why would her mother have hidden something so significant, even from her own daughter? Fear, most likely, Farron said. Whoever destroyed the royal house of Weimar that night did so thoroughly and violently, leaving little doubt that any survivors would be hunted if discovered. A mother protecting her child would have every reason to bury the truth so deeply that even the child herself never knew what she carried, until circumstances forced it into the light. Elira touched the locket at her throat, seeing it now in an entirely different way than she had just moments before. It was no longer simply a keepsake from a mother she barely remembered. It was, apparently, a key to an entire hidden history, one that connected her to a kingdom, and a bloodline she had never known existed. "What does this mean for me now?" she asked, her voice quieter than before, uncertain whether she wanted to know the answer. "It could mean many things," Farron said carefully. "If word of your survival reached the right people, those loyal to the old royal house of Weimar might rally behind you as the rightful heir to a throne that has stood empty for over 20 years. It could also mean danger if word reached the wrong people first, those who benefited from the fall of that family and would prefer the line remain extinguished rather than restored." The weight of his words settled over the room like a heavy fog. Elira had spent weeks simply trying to rebuild a quiet, ordinary life after the humiliation of her wedding night. And now she was being told that she might be heir to a throne, a target for both allies and enemies she had never known existed. It felt impossible, too large a truth to fit inside the small, simple life she had been building at Marta's Inn. "I do not want a throne," she said finally, more to herself than to either of them. "I only wanted a quiet life, and even that was taken from me weeks ago." "I understand that this is overwhelming," Farron said gently. "But knowledge like this rarely stays hidden forever, especially once someone begins asking questions, as I have been asking these past few days. It would be wiser to understand your history fully and decide how to proceed on your own terms, rather than have the truth forced upon you by someone with less kind intentions than my own." Marta moved closer, placing a steady hand on Elira's shoulder. "Whatever you decide, girl, you do not have to decide it tonight. Truths this large deserve time to settle before choices are made around them." Elira nodded gratefully, though sleep did not come easily that night. She lay awake in her small room above the inn, turning the locket over in her hands, thinking of her mother's quiet sadness, a sadness she had always attributed simply to grief over losses never fully explained. Now she understood it might have run far deeper than ordinary grief, a mother mourning not just lost loved ones, but an entire world she could never return to. A secret she carried so carefully that her own daughter grew up entirely unaware of the crown that might have once awaited her. Over the following days, Farron continued his careful research, cross-referencing old records and family histories he had collected over years of study. He confirmed details that left little room for doubt: the timing of Elira's birth, the pattern of her mother's careful avoidance of any questions about her past, even small physical resemblances Farron claimed to notice between Elira and portraits he had once seen of the Ashworth family, painted before the fall of Weimar. "There is one more piece of this puzzle that troubles me," Farron admitted one afternoon, as Elira helped him organize the scattered pages of his research. "Word of a search for the missing Ashworth heir has been quietly circulating among certain circles for years now, led not by enemies of your family, but by an ally. Someone who made a promise to your grandfather long ago, before the fall of Weimar, to protect and restore the bloodline should any survivors ever be found." "Who?" Elira asked, though a strange, uneasy feeling had already begun forming in the pit of her stomach. Farron hesitated, glancing at her carefully before answering. "The Voss family of Draymore," he said. "It is said that the old Lord Voss, Alaric's father, made a solemn vow to the dying king of Weimar, promising to search for any surviving heirs and see the rightful line restored, should the opportunity ever arise. I did not think much of the connection when I first heard your story, given how your marriage to Lord Voss ended. But now, knowing what I know of your lineage, I cannot ignore the possibility that his family's search and your own hidden history are more connected than either of you ever realized." Alira sat in stunned silence, the pieces of an impossibly tangled situation beginning to arrange themselves into a shape she could barely comprehend. The very man who had cast her out of his castle in anger and suspicion had, apparently, spent years searching for exactly the kind of secret she carried around her neck, entirely unaware that the woman he sent away in the dark of night might have been the answer to a promise his own father made decades ago. "This cannot be a coincidence," Marta murmured, having listened to the entire exchange with growing fascination. "Fate has a strange sense of humor sometimes, delivering the very thing a man searches for straight to his door, only to have him send it away before he understood what he held." "If this is true," Alira said slowly, working through the implications aloud, "then Lord Voss never knew who I truly was, not when he married me, and certainly not when he sent me away." "It seems unlikely he knew," Farron agreed. "Which raises an important question. Now that the truth is becoming clear, what do you intend to do with it? You could remain hidden here, live out a quiet life under a different name, and let this history remain buried as your mother intended. Or you could step forward, claim what may rightfully be yours, and face whatever consequences, and whatever reunions that choice might bring." Alira looked down at the locket in her palm, thinking of her mother's careful silence, of Alaric's cold command on their wedding night, of the quiet, simple life she had begun building at Marta's in over the past several weeks. None of the paths ahead of her seemed simple any longer, and for the first time since arriving at the village in the dead of night, she found herself uncertain which direction her future truly ought to take. "I need time to think," she said finally. "This is too large a decision to make in a single evening." "Take all the time you need," Farron said kindly, "though I would caution you not to take too long. Secrets like this rarely stay buried forever, and it is far better for you to control how and when this truth comes to light, rather than have it forced into the open by circumstances beyond your influence." Outside, the wind continued to press against the shuttered windows of the inn, carrying with it the distant sound of hooves on the road, a sound none of them paid particular attention to that night, though it belonged to a rider moving with quiet, careful purpose toward the very village where Alira now sat contemplating a future she had never imagined for herself. The council chamber at Draymore had not seen this many advisors gathered at once since the early days following Alaric's father's death. Word had spread quickly through the castle that Lord Voss intended to bring formal accusations against Lord Casimir, and the tension in the room was thick enough to feel as the assembled nobles took their seats around the long stone table. Alaric stood at the head of the table, the forged letter and the scribe's signed confession laid out before him, along with Corwin's carefully documented findings tracing the payment back to Casimir's household. He had rehearsed this moment countless times in his mind over the past several days, yet standing here now, about to publicly unravel the deception that had cost him his marriage, felt heavier than he had anticipated. "3 weeks ago," Alaric began, his voice carrying clearly through the chamber, "I received a letter on the night of my wedding, accusing my bride of conspiracy against this house. Believing the letter genuine, I made a decision I now understand to be gravely mistaken. I sent Lady Alira henceforth from these walls without proper investigation, without patience, and without the trust a marriage such as ours deserved." Murmurs rippled around the table, several of the older nobles exchanging glances, though none interrupted as Alaric continued. "Since that night, my steward has uncovered evidence that the letter was forged, its seal a deliberate imitation of Lady Alira's family crest, its content designed specifically to provoke exactly the reaction it received. The scribe responsible has confessed to being paid for this forgery by a servant within Lord Casimir's household." Alaric paused, letting the weight of the accusation settle fully before he continued. "I do not make this claim lightly, nor without evidence to support it." Casimir, seated near the far end of the table, had gone noticeably pale, though he recovered his composure quickly, straightening in his chair with practiced calm. "This is a serious accusation, Lord Voss, built on the word of a bribed scribe and the suspicions of a steward eager to ease his lord's guilty conscience. I would remind this council that grief and guilt often lead men to seek convenient explanations rather than uncomfortable truths. The evidence is not built on suspicion alone," Corwin said, stepping forward and placing a stack of documents on the table before the assembled council. "The payment records trace directly to your household's coffers, Lord Casimir, dated 3 days before the wedding. The servant who delivered the payment has been identified and questioned. His account matches the scribe's confession in every detail." A tense silence fell over the chamber as the council members began passing the documents among themselves, examining the evidence with growing interest. Casimir's composure, though still outwardly steady, showed small cracks at the edges, a tightness around his eyes that betrayed the confidence in his voice. "Even if such payments occurred," Casimir said carefully, "it proves only that funds left my household, not that I personally ordered any such forgery. A steward or servant acting without my knowledge could easily be responsible for such a scheme." "A convenient defense," one of the older council members, Lord Bramwell, said dryly. "Though I would ask why a servant acting entirely alone would choose to forge a letter specifically designed to end an alliance that has long stood in the way of your own ambitions along the eastern border, Lord Casimir. The timing and target of this deception align rather precisely with your interests. Wouldn't you agree?" Casimir's jaw tightened, and for a moment Alaric watched something calculating pass behind his eyes, a man weighing how much longer his denial could hold against the mounting evidence before him. "I will not stand here and be tried on suspicion and coincidence," he said finally, rising from his seat. "If this council intends to pursue such baseless accusations further, I demand proper proceedings, conducted with impartial judgment, rather than this hurried spectacle." "Proper proceedings will indeed follow," Alaric said, his voice cold and steady now. "But make no mistake, Lord Casimir. This council will not allow the matter to rest quietly, not when the evidence points so clearly toward deliberate sabotage of an alliance, and toward the wrongful banishment of an innocent woman from this house." The meeting continued for another hour, council members debating the appropriate next steps, while Casimir grew increasingly guarded, offering fewer and fewer responses as the evidence against him mounted. By the time the chamber finally emptied, it had been decided that a formal investigation would proceed, with Casimir's household subject to further scrutiny and his movements monitored closely until the matter reached its conclusion. Alaric remained in the chamber long after the others had left, staring down at the documents spread across the table, the weight of everything settling over him now that the confrontation was finished. Corwin lingered nearby, watching him with quiet concern. "You did what needed to be done," Corwin said. "Casimir will not escape this easily, not with evidence this thoroughly documented." "It does not undo what I already did to Elira," Alaric said quietly. "Exposing Casimir's scheme will not erase the night I sent her out into the darkness without giving her a fair chance to explain herself." "No," Corwin agreed, "but it is a start. Clearing her name publicly, admitting your error before this council. These are steps in the right direction, even if they cannot undo what has already happened." Alaric nodded slowly, though the guilt sat heavily in his chest regardless. "I need to find her, Corwin. Not simply to clear her name through official channels, but to see her, to apologize properly, to explain myself in a way this council chamber could never allow." "Then we should move quickly," Corwin said. "Casimir, cornered as he now is, may grow desperate. A man with nothing left to lose sometimes takes actions he would never have considered otherwise. If he suspects that Lady Elira's testimony could further strengthen the case against him, or if he learns what I have recently uncovered about her family's history, he may see her as more than simply a loose end to be managed quietly." "What have you uncovered?" Alaric asked, straightening at the sudden shift in Corwin's tone. Corwin hesitated, choosing his words carefully. "In tracing the origins of Casimir's scheme, I found correspondence suggesting he had been researching old records related to the fall of Weimar, specifically the fate of its royal family. I do not yet understand the full connection, but it seems Casimir's interest in destroying your alliance with Lady Alira's family may run deeper than simple political rivalry. He may have suspected something about her lineage that we ourselves did not yet know. Alaric's expression shifted from guilt to alarm. You believe Alira may be connected to Vamer's lost royal line. I believe it is possible, Corwin said. Your father spent years searching quietly for any surviving heirs, honoring the promise he made to the dying king of Vamer before his death. If Casimir discovered even a fragment of that same information, tracing it back to Lady Alira's family, it would explain why he went to such extreme lengths to end your alliance before it could properly begin. A restored heir to Vamer's throne, allied with Draymore through marriage, would significantly threaten any ambitions he holds toward that territory. The pieces began falling into place in Alaric's mind with dizzying speed. His father's old search, conducted so quietly and carefully over the final years of his life, the promise made to a dying king that Alaric had inherited as an unfinished obligation, the sudden and calculated destruction of his marriage on the very night it began. If Corwin's suspicions were correct, then Alira was not simply an innocent woman wrongly accused. She might be the very heir his own family had spent years searching for, the fulfillment of a promise Alaric had assumed would never be realized. We need to find her immediately, Alaric said, already moving toward the door. If Casimir suspects what you suspect, she may be in far greater danger than either of us realized. Agreed, Corwin said, following quickly behind him. I will gather a small party of trusted riders. We should move discreetly, avoiding drawing further attention until we understand the full scope of what we are dealing with. Within the hour, Alaric rode out from Draymore with Corwin and 3 trusted guards, following the same road Alira had walked weeks earlier under far different circumstances. The autumn air had grown colder since that night, the fields along the roadside now bare and quiet, and Alaric found himself replaying every moment of that terrible wedding night as they rode, wondering how differently things might have unfolded had he simply paused long enough to ask a single question before passing judgment. They stopped at several villages along the way, making careful, quiet inquiries about a woman traveling alone, fitting Alira's description, without revealing the true purpose behind their search. Progress was slow, frustratingly so, each dead end adding to the growing urgency Alaric felt pressing against his chest like a physical weight. He thought of Casimir's cornered desperation back at Draymore, of the possibility that the same ambitious cruelty that had orchestrated the forged letter might now be turned toward something far more dangerous, and he pushed his horse harder along the road, unwilling to waste a single unnecessary moment. It was nearly evening on the second day of searching when they finally arrived at a village larger than the others they had passed through, its square lined with modest shops and a single inn glowing warmly against the coming darkness. Corwin, riding slightly ahead, slowed his horse as they approached, glancing back at Alaric with something unreadable in his expression. "What is it?" Alaric asked, drawing his own horse alongside. "I believe," Corwin said slowly, "that we may have finally found the right village." Alaric's heart pounded as they approached the inn, the same warm yellow light Alira had once found so welcoming now glowing invitingly in the gathering dusk. He dismounted quickly, his hand instinctively moving to smooth his travel-worn clothes, an old, half-forgotten instinct from the courtship days he had nearly abandoned entirely since their wedding night. Whatever awaited him inside those walls, he understood now that it would change everything he thought he knew, not just about the woman he had wronged, but about the promise his family had carried for over 20 years, finally within reach after so long a search. The common room of the inn was quieter than usual that evening, most travelers having already retired for the night, leaving only a handful of tables occupied as Alira moved between them, refilling cups and clearing empty plates. Farron sat in his usual corner, papers spread before him, deep in concentration as he cross-referenced yet another old record he had managed to track down through a contact in a neighboring town. Marta stood behind the counter, keeping half an eye on the room while mending a torn apron. None of them noticed the small group of riders dismounting outside until the door swung open, letting in a rush of cold night air, along with a man whose presence immediately changed the entire feeling of the room. Elira, standing near the far table with a tray still in her hands, felt her breath catch the moment she recognized him. Alaric stood in the doorway, travel-worn and clearly exhausted from days of hard riding, his eyes scanning the room with an urgency that faltered the instant they found her. For a long moment, neither of them moved, the noise of the inn fading into an uncomfortable silence as the other patrons glanced up, sensing the sudden tension without understanding its cause. "Elira," Alaric said, his voice quieter than she remembered, none of the cold command from their wedding night present in it now. The tray in her hands trembled slightly before she set it down on the nearest table, her mind racing through a dozen different responses, none of which felt adequate for the moment. "What are you doing here?" she finally managed, her voice carrying more steadiness than she actually felt. "I have been searching for you," Alaric said, stepping further into the room, Corwin and the guards remaining respectfully near the door. "There is a great deal I need to tell you, and even more I need to apologize for." Farron, who had gone very still at his corner table the moment Alaric entered, rose slowly, gathering his papers with deliberate care. "Lord Voss," he said, his scholar's instinct for timing prompting him to insert himself carefully into the moment. "Perhaps it would be wise for you to sit. What I have to share may explain a great deal about why you have spent so long searching, and why your search has led you here of all places." Alaric turned toward him, confusion flickering across his features. "Who are you?" "My name is Farron," the scholar said. "A researcher of old bloodlines and family histories, currently a guest at this fine inn, and, as fortune would have it, a man who has spent the past several days uncovering something rather significant about the woman standing before you." Elira felt her stomach tighten with a mixture of nerves and something dangerously close to hope, though she was not yet ready to name it. "Farron," she said quietly, "perhaps this is not the moment." "On the contrary," Farron said gently, "I believe this may be precisely the moment. Lord Voss has clearly ridden a great distance to find you, and I suspect what brought him here connects directly to what I have discovered about your mother's locket." Alaric's attention snapped toward the small silver piece visible at Elira's throat, and something in his expression shifted rapidly from confusion to a dawning, disbelieving realization. "The locket," he said slowly. "Corwin, show her the seal." Corwin stepped forward, producing a small folded document from within his travel cloak, unfolding it carefully to reveal a detailed rendering of a crest, one that matched almost exactly the engraving inside Elira's locket. The room seemed to hold its breath as Elira stared at the paper, then at her own locket, then back up at Alaric, the pieces of an impossibly large puzzle beginning to click into place before her eyes. "This is the crest my father's search always centered around," Alaric said, his voice unsteady now with the weight of understanding. "The royal house of Weimar. My father made a promise to their dying king over 20 years ago to find any surviving heirs and see the bloodline restored, should the opportunity ever present itself. I inherited that promise when he died, though I confess I had nearly given up hope of ever fulfilling it." "I discovered the same connection just days ago," Farron said, gesturing toward his scattered papers. The blessing Elira remembers her mother reciting, the crest inside the locket, even certain resemblances to old portraits of the Ashworth family, all point toward the same conclusion. Lady Elira is, by every indication I have been able to gather, the missing heir your family has spent over 2 decades searching for. Elira sank slowly into the nearest chair, the tray she had abandoned entirely forgotten now, her mind struggling to hold the enormity of what was being confirmed in front of her. "You searched for me," she said, looking up at Alaric with an expression caught somewhere between disbelief and something that felt dangerously close to bitter irony. "You spent years searching for the very woman you sent away in the middle of the night, without a single moment's hesitation." The words landed exactly as sharply as she intended them to, and Alaric flinched visibly, guilt flooding his features. "I did not know," he said. I swear to you, Alira, if I had known even a fraction of what I now understand, I would never have. You would never have what? Alira interrupted, rising from her chair now, weeks of carefully controlled hurt finally breaking through the surface. Sent me away over a forged letter without asking a single question. Made me walk alone in the dark to a village I had never seen, with nothing but a small bag and a chest containing the only thing left of my mother. Would knowing my supposed bloodline have changed how quickly you were willing to believe the worst of me? The room had gone completely silent now, the few remaining patrons watching the exchange with wide, curious eyes, though none dared interrupt. Marta moved quietly from behind the counter, standing close to Alira in silent support, while Corwin and the guards remained near the door, uncertain whether to intervene or simply let the confrontation run its course. No, Alaric said quietly, meeting her eyes directly despite the pain evident in his own. It would not have changed the mistake I made that night. Nothing changes that mistake, Alira. I acted out of fear rooted in my own family's past, and I failed you completely in the one moment that should have mattered most. The moment when I should have trusted the woman I had chosen to marry over a stranger's forged accusation. Alira felt tears threatening at the corners of her eyes, though she refused to let them fall in front of him, just as she had refused on the night he sent her away. Do you have any idea what those weeks were like for me? Walking through that village gate not knowing where I would sleep, not knowing if my own father would even believe my side of the story once word reached him. I have thought of little else since that night, Alaric said, his voice breaking slightly for the first time. Every road I have ridden since, I have searched for some sign of you, some way to undo what I had done. When Corwin uncovered the truth about the letter, about Casimir's involvement, I came here the moment I understood there was a chance of finding you. Casimir? Alira asked, the name unfamiliar to her, though the mention of a deliberate scheme rather than simple misunderstanding shifted something in her expression. Lord Casimir orchestrated the entire deception, Corwin said, stepping forward now to explain further. He paid a scribe to forge the letter that ended your wedding night, hoping to destroy the alliance between your families before it could threaten his own ambitions along the border. We suspect, though we cannot yet prove entirely, that he may have discovered something about your family's true history and acted specifically to prevent your bloodline from ever being restored. The revelation added an entirely new layer to everything Alira had already absorbed that evening, and she found herself needing to sit back down, the weight of forged letters, hidden bloodlines, and political conspiracies pressing down on her all at once. Farron, ever the careful observer, quietly gathered his papers and stepped back, sensing that the moment now belonged entirely to Alaric and Alira, regardless of the larger political implications swirling around them. I do not know what to do with any of this, Alira admitted quietly, staring down at the locket in her hands rather than meeting Alaric's eyes. Weeks ago, I was simply your bride, cast out for a crime I never committed. Now I am apparently the heir to a kingdom I never knew existed, and the very family that wronged me is the same family that has spent years searching for me. It is too much to hold all at once. You do not need to decide anything tonight, Alaric said gently, though every part of him wanted desperately to fix everything in this single moment, to erase the weeks of hurt with words alone. I did not come here expecting instant forgiveness, Alira. I came here because you deserve to know the truth, and because I could not continue living with the guilt of what I had done without at least attempting to make it right. Alira looked up at him then, studying his face carefully, searching for the same coldness that had defined him on their wedding night. She found instead something far more vulnerable, a man clearly worn down by weeks of guilt and urgent searching, standing before her without the protective armor of anger or suspicion he had worn that terrible night. You cast me out without a single question, she said finally, her voice steadier now, though still carrying the weight of everything she had endured. If you truly wish to make this right, Alaric, it will not be through grand gestures or public exposure of Casimir's scheme, however necessary those things may be. It will be through proving over time that you have learned to trust rather than simply react. Words alone will not undo what happened. Only actions will. Then I will prove it, Alaric said, without hesitation, the determination in his voice unmistakable. For as long as it takes, I will prove it. Outside the inn, unnoticed by anyone caught up in the emotional weight of the moment, a lone figure lingered in the shadows near the stables, watching the warmly lit windows with careful attention before quietly slipping back into the darkness, mounting a horse, and riding swiftly back in the direction of Casimir's territory, carrying news that would soon set an even more dangerous chain of events into motion. Casimir received the news from his spy well after midnight, pacing the length of his study, as the man recounted everything he had witnessed outside the village inn. The confirmation that Alira was indeed the missing Ashworth heir, combined with the knowledge that Alaric now possessed clear evidence of the forged letter, left Casimir with far fewer options than he had anticipated when he first set his scheme into motion weeks earlier. "You are certain of what you heard?" Casimir asked, though the tightness in his voice suggested he already believed every word. "Certain, my lord," the spy confirmed. The scholar spoke openly of her lineage, and Lord Voss confirmed the connection to his father's old search. "If the council formally recognizes her claim, and if she and Lord Voss reconcile, the alliance you sought to prevent will not only proceed, it will become far more powerful than originally feared, backed by Weimer's rightful heir herself." Casimir stopped pacing, staring into the dying embers of his study fire as his mind raced through the rapidly narrowing set of choices before him. The investigation already underway at Draymore's council threatened his standing regardless of what happened next, but a restored alliance between Draymore and a legitimate heir to Weimer's throne would eliminate any hope he had of expanding his own influence along that contested border. Desperation, an emotion he rarely allowed himself to feel, began creeping into his calculations. "Send word to our contacts near the border," he said finally, his voice cold and decisive despite the fear underlying it. "If the girl cannot be prevented from claiming her heritage through quiet means, then perhaps a more direct approach is warranted before this alliance solidifies beyond our ability to interfere." The spy hesitated, clearly uncomfortable with the implication behind Casimir's words. "My lord, direct action against a claimed royal heir, especially one already under Lord Voss's protection, carries considerable risk. Should such an action be traced back to you, particularly now with the council already investigating the forged letter." "I am well aware of the risk," Casimir snapped, cutting him off sharply, "but the risk of doing nothing is far greater. If this alliance proceeds unchallenged, my position along the border becomes untenable within the year. I would rather gamble on decisive action than wait quietly for my own downfall." Back at the village inn, unaware of the danger now taking shape against her, Alira spent the following days in a strange, uncertain limbo, caught between the quiet life she had built at Marta's inn and the overwhelming reality of a heritage she had never asked for. Alaric remained in the village as well, taking a room at a modest lodging house nearby rather than pressing Alira for the immediate reconciliation he clearly longed for, honoring the distance she had requested that first difficult evening. He visited the inn each day, never pushing, never demanding, simply present, offering small gestures of consideration that slowly, carefully, began to soften the guarded wall Alira had built around herself since that terrible wedding night. He helped Marta repair a broken shutter without being asked. He sat quietly with Farron, listening intently as the scholar explained more details about Weimer's history and the responsibilities that would come with claiming her heritage, absorbing information that would help him understand what Alira herself was now facing. "You do not have to keep coming here every day," Alira told him one afternoon, as she found him once again seated near the fire, this time helping Farron organize a stack of old records rather than seeking her out directly. "I know I do not have to," Alaric said, looking up from the papers in his hands. "But I want to. I told you I intended to prove myself through action rather than words, and I meant it, even if that simply means being present, learning what I should have taken the time to learn about you and your history long before our wedding night ever arrived." Alira found herself softening slightly despite her best efforts to remain guarded, though she was careful not to let it show too plainly. "And what have you learned?" she asked, settling into a chair across from him despite herself. "That the Ashworth line was known not just for its royal authority, but for a particular commitment to fairness in governance," Alaric said, gesturing toward one of Farron's older texts. "Your grandfather, apparently, was known throughout Weimar for personally hearing disputes between common farmers rather than delegating such matters entirely to lesser officials. It seems your family's legacy runs deeper than simple bloodline. It is a legacy of genuine care for the people under your protection." "You say that as though you expect it to reassure me," Alira said, though there was less edge in her voice than there had been days earlier. "I say it because I find it remarkable," Alaric replied honestly. "And because I am beginning to understand that the woman who sat across from me during our wedding correspondence, the woman who cared so deeply about fairness and honesty, even in her letters to a stranger she had never met, carries that same legacy within her, whether she claims the throne of Weimar or not." Alira looked away, unwilling to let him see how deeply his words affected her, though the careful, patient version of Alaric sitting before her now bore little resemblance to the cold, commanding figure who had sent her away weeks earlier. She was not yet ready to fully trust that transformation, not after everything she had endured, but she found herself, day by day, less certain of the anger she had been so carefully holding onto. It was on the 5th day of this careful, tentative reconciliation that everything changed once again. Corwin arrived at the inn just after midday, his expression grave, having received urgent word from Draymore that demanded immediate attention. "Riders were spotted crossing into the border territory near this village late last night," Corwin said, addressing both Alaric and Alira with clear urgency. "Men known to serve Lord Casimir, moving with unusual haste and secrecy. Given everything we now understand about his desperation, I believe it would be unwise to assume their presence here is coincidental." Alaric's expression hardened immediately, all the careful patience of the past few days giving way to sharp, protective focus. "You believe Casimir intends to move against Alira directly?" "I believe it is a possibility we cannot afford to ignore," Corwin confirmed. "A man cornered by mounting evidence against him, facing the collapse of his ambitions along the border, may see removing the threat entirely as his only remaining option, however reckless such a decision would be." Alira felt a cold shiver of fear pass through her, the abstract danger she had been warned about suddenly becoming very real and very immediate. "What do you suggest we do?" "We move you to Draymore immediately," Alaric said, already rising from his chair, every instinct in him shifting toward protection rather than patience now that genuine danger loomed. "The castle can be secured far more effectively than this village inn, and the council's ongoing investigation into Casimir provides additional leverage should he attempt anything further against you." Alira hesitated, old wounds resurfacing at the mention of returning to the very castle from which she had been cast out weeks earlier. "I am not certain I am ready to return there, Alaric, regardless of the danger." "I understand your hesitation," Alaric said, softening his tone despite the urgency of the moment. "But your safety must come before either of our discomforts right now. I promise you, this time, you will not be a prisoner within those walls, nor a bride commanded to leave at the first sign of trouble. You will be protected, respected, and free to leave whenever you choose, once this danger has passed." Marta, who had been listening from behind the counter, stepped forward with quiet concern. "The girl has become dear to me these past weeks. Whatever you decide, Alira, know that you are welcome to return to this inn whenever you wish, castle or no castle." Alira reached out and squeezed Marta's hand gratefully, deeply moved by the kindness this stranger had shown her since the night she arrived at the inn with nothing but a small bag and a broken heart. "Thank you, Marta, for everything." She turned back to Alaric, weighing the fear of returning to Draymore against the far greater fear of remaining exposed to whatever danger Casimir's desperation might bring. "Very well," she said finally. "I will return to Draymore, but only under the conditions you have promised, Alaric. I will not be commanded again. I will be consulted, respected, and treated as an equal in every decision that affects my safety and my future." "You have my word," Alaric said, meeting her eyes with a solemnity that carried none of the coldness from their wedding night, only genuine determination to honor the promise he had just made. "This time, I will not fail you." Within the hour, preparations were underway for the journey back to Draymore, Corwin organizing additional guards to accompany them along the road while Farron gathered his research materials, insisting on accompanying the group to formally present his findings before the council himself. As they prepared to depart, Elira glanced back one final time at the small inn that had sheltered her through the most difficult weeks of her life, grateful for the unexpected refuge it had provided, and uncertain but resolute about the far more complicated future now waiting for her behind the walls of Draymore Castle. The ride back proved tense from the very first mile, every rider alert to the possibility of ambush along a road that had, until recently, seemed entirely unremarkable. Alaric stayed close to Elira's side throughout the journey, his earlier patience now replaced by a fierce, watchful protectiveness that left no doubt in anyone's mind how seriously he now regarded the danger surrounding her. Whatever awaited them at Draymore, whatever move Casimir intended to make in his desperation, both Alaric and Elira understood that the coming days would determine far more than simply the fate of their fractured marriage. They would determine whether the promise made to a dying king over 20 years ago would finally be fulfilled, or whether it would be extinguished once, and for all by a man determined to prevent it at any cost. The attack came just as the towers of Draymore rose into view on the horizon, exactly at the point along the road where the forest pressed closest to the path, offering the kind of cover a group of riders might use to remain hidden until the last possible moment. Corwin, riding at the front of the party, spotted the movement among the trees first, raising a sharp warning cry that sent every guard reaching for their weapons in a single practiced motion. "Stay close to me," Alaric said, positioning his horse protectively beside Elira's as a group of 6 riders burst from the tree line, moving with the coordinated speed of men who had planned this ambush carefully in advance. There was no mistaking their intent, nor the crest barely visible on the shoulder of one rider's cloak, a crest belonging to Casimir's household. What followed was chaotic and fast, guards moving to intercept the attacking riders while Corwin shouted commands, attempting to keep the formation tight around Elira and Alaric as the fighting broke out on the road. Elira's horse reared in fright at the sudden clash of steel nearby, and she fought to keep her seat, her heart pounding as she watched men she had never met fighting fiercely, some for her protection and some, apparently, for her destruction. One of the attacking riders broke through the guard's defensive line, charging directly toward Elira with clear, deliberate purpose. Alaric moved instantly, positioning his own horse between them, drawing his sword in a fluid motion that spoke of years of training beneath the more diplomatic role he usually occupied. The clash that followed was brief but fierce, Alaric's focused determination overwhelming his opponent's desperate aggression within moments, the attacking rider falling back, wounded, as 2 of Draymore's guards moved quickly to subdue him. The remaining attackers, seeing their companion fall and recognizing the tide of the skirmish turning decisively against them, broke formation and fled back toward the tree line, abandoning whatever plan Casimir had entrusted to them. Corwin ordered a brief pursuit, though it was quickly called off, the priority shifting instead to ensuring Elira's safety and continuing swiftly toward the protection of Draymore's walls. "Are you hurt?" Alaric asked urgently, wheeling his horse back around toward Elira the moment the immediate danger had passed, his voice carrying a rawness that betrayed just how frightened he had truly been in those chaotic moments. "I am unharmed," Elira said, though her hands still trembled slightly as she steadied her horse. "Thanks to you." "We should not linger here," Corwin said, glancing warily toward the tree line where the attackers had disappeared. "If Casimir sent one group, he may have others positioned along different points of the road. Draymore's walls will offer far greater safety than remaining exposed out here." The remainder of the ride passed without further incident, though the tension among the party remained high until the castle gates finally closed behind them, sealing Alira within walls she had never expected to see again after the night she was cast out. This time, however, the atmosphere felt entirely different. Servants who had witnessed her humiliating departure weeks earlier now watched with quiet curiosity, as she was escorted through the halls not as a disgraced bride, but as an honored guest under the personal protection of Lord Voss himself. Within hours of their return, Alaric convened the council once again, this time with far more urgent business than simply reviewing evidence against Casimir. The attempted attack on the road provided undeniable proof of Casimir's desperation, evidence that transformed the council's careful investigation into an immediate and decisive matter requiring swift action. Lord Casimir has moved beyond scheming and deception, Alaric told the assembled council, his voice carrying an authority that left no room for doubt or hesitation. He has now attempted direct violence against Lady Alira, the confirmed heir to Vamer's throne, in a desperate attempt to prevent an alliance he correctly fears will end his ambitions along our shared border. This council can no longer treat this matter as a private grievance between two houses. It is now a matter of open aggression that demands a unified response. The council members, many of whom had grown increasingly uneasy over the preceding weeks as evidence against Casimir mounted, needed little additional persuasion. Within days, formal charges were brought against him, backed not only by Corwin's meticulously documented evidence of the forged letter, but by the testimony of the wounded attacker captured during the ambush, who, faced with the reality of his situation, confirmed that he had indeed been acting under direct orders from Casimir's household. Casimir's downfall, once set into motion, proceeded swiftly. Stripped of his title and holdings by unanimous council decision, he was escorted from his lands under guard, his ambitions toward the border territory permanently extinguished by the very desperation that had driven him to such reckless action in the first place. Farron, present at the council proceedings to formally submit his research confirming Alira's lineage, watched the entire process with quiet satisfaction, understanding better than most just how significant this resolution truly was, not only for Alira personally, but for the long-delayed fulfillment of a promise made decades earlier between two royal houses. With Casimir's threat finally eliminated and Alira's identity formally recognized before the full council, a new kind of quiet settled over Draymore, one that allowed Alira and Alaric, for the first time since their disastrous wedding night, the space to simply exist together without the shadow of danger or deception hanging over every interaction. Yet Alira remained cautious, unwilling to rush back into the marriage that had begun so painfully, regardless of how thoroughly Alaric had proven his commitment to protecting and respecting her since their reunion at the village inn. "I do not doubt your intentions any longer," she told him one evening, as they walked together along the castle's garden path, the autumn air crisp but no longer as biting as it had been on the night she was sent away. "But intentions alone were not enough that first time. I need to know that what we build now is built on genuine partnership, not simply obligation or guilt over past mistakes." "I understand completely," Alaric said, stopping beside a stone bench overlooking the garden's quiet fountain. "I do not wish for you to return to this marriage out of obligation any more than you do, Alira. If we are to begin again, I want it to be because you have chosen it freely, understanding fully who I am, flaws and all, not because circumstances have simply pushed us back together." Alira studied him carefully, searching his expression for any trace of the impatience or pride that had defined him on their wedding night. She found instead a quiet, steady patience that had not wavered once throughout the weeks of careful rebuilding since their reunion. "Then perhaps," she said slowly, "we should begin as we should have from the very start, not as strangers bound by political necessity, but as two people genuinely choosing to know one another." Over the following months, that is precisely what they did. Alaric made a point of involving Alira directly in matters affecting Draymore's governance, seeking her perspective on decisions large and small, honoring the promise he had made never to command her decisions without consultation again. Alira, in turn, began the difficult but meaningful work of understanding her own heritage more fully, working closely with Farron and a small council of Vamer's remaining loyalists who had emerged once word of her survival spread, to determine how best to honor her family's legacy while building a genuine life alongside the man she was slowly, carefully, learning to trust once again. Their courtship, this second one built on honesty rather than political arrangement, unfolded with none of the hurried formality that had characterized their first, disastrous attempt at marriage. Alaric learned the particular way Elira preferred her tea, the songs she remembered fragments of from childhood, the quiet strength she carried beneath her careful composure. Elira, in turn, discovered a version of Alaric rarely seen by those outside his closest circle, a man burdened by inherited responsibility and old grief, who had spent years guarding himself against exactly the kind of vulnerability their growing relationship now required of him. It was nearly a year after that terrible wedding night when Alaric finally asked Elira, properly this time, whether she would consider marrying him again, not through political arrangement or family obligation, but simply because two people had come to know and care for one another deeply through the difficult journey they had shared. Elira, standing in the same garden where they had first begun rebuilding their fractured relationship, felt none of the uncertainty that had colored their first wedding. "Yes," she said simply without hesitation, watching relief and joy break across Alaric's face in equal measure. "This time, I choose it freely, Alaric. Not because circumstances demand it, but because I want to." Their second wedding, held in the very same great hall where their first had ended so painfully, bore almost no resemblance to the hurried, politically necessary ceremony that had preceded it. This time, the hall was filled not with careful political calculation, but with genuine warmth, Marta traveling from her village in to attend, seated proudly near the front alongside Corwin and Farron, whose careful research had ultimately brought two families' long-separated destinies back together after over 20 years of searching and waiting. As Alaric placed the ring on Elira's finger once again, this time with none of the formal distance that had characterized their first exchange, he found himself thinking not of duty or promises inherited from his father, or even the political significance of the alliance now being formally sealed between Draymore and the restored line of Vamer. He thought only of the woman standing before him, who had endured betrayal, uncertainty, and danger with a quiet strength that had transformed his understanding of trust itself. "I promise you," he said quietly, meant only for her ears despite the crowded hall around them, "that I will never again let fear speak louder than trust, not where you are concerned." "And I promise you," Elira replied, her eyes bright with tears that this time carried only joy, "that whatever comes next we will face it together, as equals exactly as we should have from the very beginning." Outside the castle walls, word of the restored alliance between Draymore and Vamer's rightful heir spread quickly through the surrounding territories, bringing renewed stability to a border region that had long suffered under the shadow of Casimir's ambitions. The promise made over 20 years earlier by a dying king to a loyal friend had finally been fulfilled, not through grand political maneuvering alone, but through the genuine, hard-won trust between two people who had chosen, despite every obstacle placed before them, to build something real together. As the wedding feast continued late into the evening, Elira found herself standing near the same window where, months earlier, Alaric had watched her disappear into the darkness with guilt and doubt weighing heavily on his heart. Now she stood there beside him, no longer a bride commanded to leave, but a woman who had claimed her own heritage, her own strength, and ultimately her own choice to return, not out of obligation, but out of genuine, freely given love. 2 years after their second wedding, Draymore looked like a different place entirely. The quiet tension that had once hung over the castle halls, born of old grief and inherited suspicion, had given way to something warmer, a household run not by fear of betrayal, but by the steady partnership between its lord and lady. Elira had taken on much of the responsibility for rebuilding Vamer's shattered territory beyond the eastern border, traveling frequently between Draymore and the small but growing settlement that had begun forming around the old capital ruins, where loyalists to her family had slowly gathered once word of her survival spread. The work was not easy. Weimar had been abandoned for over 2 decades, its old roads overgrown, its former administrative buildings little more than crumbling stone, and its people scattered across neighboring territories, many of them having built entirely new lives with no expectation that the royal line might ever return. Heir approached the task with the same quiet determination that had carried her through the darkest weeks of her exile from Dremor, meeting personally with farmers and craftsmen who remembered stories of the Old Kingdom, passed down from their parents and grandparents, listening to their concerns with the same careful attention her own grandfather had once been known for. Alaric supported her efforts fully, dividing his own time between Dremor's affairs and the growing needs of Weimar's restoration, though he was careful never to overshadow Heir's leadership in matters concerning her own people. Their partnership, hard-won through the difficult early months of their reconciliation, had settled into something neither of them could have imagined on that terrible wedding night years earlier. A genuine collaboration built on equal respect rather than the rigid hierarchy that had defined so many arranged marriages among the nobility. It was during the early spring of their 3rd year together that a new challenge arrived, though one far removed from the danger and deception that had shaped their earlier trials. A delegation arrived from a distant northern territory, led by a young nobleman named Edmund Pharaoh, seeking an audience regarding old trade agreements that had lapsed following Weimar's fall decades earlier. The delegation's arrival coincided with growing concerns among Weimar's resettled population about food shortages heading into the coming winter months, concerns that made the timing of Pharaoh's proposal particularly significant. "Your father's kingdom once held favorable trade terms with our territory," Pharaoh explained during his formal audience with Heir, held in the newly restored council hall at the heart of Weimar's rebuilding capital. "Grain, timber, and livestock flowed freely between our lands before the fall. I come representing my own family's interest in re-establishing those agreements, now that Weimar's rightful heir has returned to claim her legacy." Heir listened carefully, weighing the genuine opportunity such an agreement might offer against the natural caution any wise ruler ought to exercise with an unfamiliar delegation. She had learned, through hard experience, not to accept promises at face value simply because they arrived wrapped in polite formality and apparent goodwill. "I welcome the possibility of renewed trade between our territories," she said carefully, "though I would ask for time to review the specific terms you propose, along with verification of your family's own standing and history regarding these old agreements. Weimar's people have suffered greatly from broken promises in the past, Lord Pharaoh. I intend to be thorough before committing them to any new arrangement." Pharaoh accepted her caution graciously, offering full transparency regarding his proposal and welcoming whatever verification she deemed necessary. Over the following weeks, Heir worked closely with Corwin, who had proven himself an invaluable advisor even beyond Dremor's own affairs, carefully reviewing the historical trade records Farron had managed to locate among old Weimar archives, cross-referencing them against Pharaoh's proposed terms. What emerged from this careful review was not deception, as Heir had cautiously prepared herself to discover, but a genuinely beneficial arrangement that would provide much-needed resources to Weimar's resettling population, while opening new economic opportunities that had been dormant for over 20 years. The trade agreement, finalized after careful negotiation that honored both territories' interests fairly, marked one of the first significant steps toward Weimar's full economic recovery, a milestone that brought genuine celebration among the people who had waited so long for their kingdom's restoration. Alaric watched Heir navigate these complex negotiations with quiet pride, recognizing in her careful, deliberate approach to leadership many of the same qualities Farron had once described belonging to her grandfather. A genuine commitment to fairness balanced against necessary caution, earned through hard experience. It was a far different kind of governance than the more guarded, suspicious approach Alaric himself had once favored, shaped by his own family's painful history of betrayal, and he found himself, over time, adopting some of Alira's more open, collaborative instincts within his own decisions at Draymore. That same spring brought news that Casimir, stripped of his title and holdings years earlier, had died quietly in exile, his ambitions toward the border territory having come to nothing beyond the ruin of his own reputation and standing. The news arrived with little fanfare, a small footnote in the ongoing correspondence between Draymore and the neighboring territories, though Alaric could not help but reflect, upon hearing it, how differently his own life might have unfolded had that single forged letter never been delivered on his wedding night. He shared this reflection with Alira one evening as they walked together through Draymore's gardens, now in full spring bloom. "Do you ever think," he asked, "how strange it is that the worst night of both our lives ultimately led us here, to everything we have built together since?" Alira considered the question carefully before answering. "I have thought of it many times," she admitted. "There were moments during those weeks at Marta's when I believed my life had simply fallen apart beyond any hope of repair. I could not have imagined, standing in that dark road the night you sent me away, that it would eventually lead to reclaiming an entire lost kingdom, or to a marriage built on far stronger foundations than the one we began with. I am grateful every day that you gave me the chance to rebuild what I so carelessly broke," Alaric said. "Not every mistake deserves a second chance, Alira, I know that. I have never forgotten how close I came to losing you entirely through my own fear and pride." "You did lose me for a time," Alira said gently, though without bitterness now, the old wound having long since healed into simply another part of the story that had shaped who they had both become. "But we found our way back to each other, through honesty rather than obligation. That matters far more than the mistake itself, I think." Later that year, their family grew with the birth of their first child, a daughter they named Wren, born during the height of autumn just as the harvest festivities filled both Draymore and Vamer's resettling capital with celebration. Marta traveled from her village in once again to witness the joyful occasion, insisting on personally preparing a small feast in the child's honor, much to the amusement of Draymore's own kitchen staff, who had grown accustomed to the innkeeper's occasional visits and her stubborn insistence on contributing her own cooking to important family occasions. "She has her mother's eyes," Marta observed, holding the infant carefully while Alira rested nearby, still recovering from the long hours of labor. "And I suspect, given everything I have watched this family overcome these past years, she will grow up knowing far more about resilience and genuine partnership than most children born to royal houses ever learn." Farron, too, remained a close and cherished friend to the family in the years that followed, continuing his research into Vamer's history while also serving as an informal tutor to young Wren as she grew, filling her early years with stories of her family's long and complicated history, ensuring that the legacy so carefully hidden by her grandmother decades earlier would never again be lost to silence and fear. As Wren grew older, she came to know the story of her parents' difficult beginning not as a source of shame, but as proof of what genuine change and honest reconciliation could accomplish, even after the deepest betrayals. Alira made a point of telling her the full story herself, once she was old enough to understand it, including the painful parts, the wedding night, the forged letter, the weeks of exile and uncertainty, believing firmly that her daughter deserved to understand both the mistakes her parents had made and the genuine effort it had taken to overcome them. "Your father was not perfect," Alira told her daughter one evening, many years after that first terrible wedding night had faded into simply another chapter of their shared history. "He made a grave mistake, born of fear rather than malice, and it very nearly cost us everything. But he chose, afterward, to face that mistake honestly, to prove through years of patient action that he had truly changed, rather than simply asking for forgiveness and expecting it to be given freely." "And you forgave him," Wren said, still young enough to find the concept somewhat difficult to fully grasp. "I chose to give him the chance to earn that forgiveness," Alira corrected gently. "There is a difference, my dear. Forgiveness given too easily teaches nothing. Trust rebuilt slowly, through consistent honesty and genuine effort, become something far stronger than what existed before it was broken. Draymore and Vamer continued to flourish together in the years that followed, their alliance serving as a model for other territories navigating their own complicated political relationships. While Alaric and Alira's genuine partnership, built from the wreckage of a single terrible night and rebuilt through patient, honest effort, remained the quiet foundation beneath everything they accomplished together. What had begun as a political arrangement threatened almost immediately by suspicion, deception, and fear had transformed, over years of deliberate work, into something far more enduring. A marriage built not on obligation or inherited promises, but on the genuine choice made freely by two people to trust each other completely, and to keep choosing that trust again and again for the rest of their lives together.